2 years ago, I made what I thought was the hardest decision of my life. I threw my youngest son out of my house, out of my company, and out of my family. Danny had taken $50,000 that wasn't his to take, and I couldn't tolerate a thief under my roof. Not in the Sterling family. Not in my empire. Sterling real estate had been my life's work for 43 years. Starting with a single duplex in Scottsdale, I'd built it into a $300 million operation spanning all of Arizona. Phoenix skyline showed my mark. Sterling Towers downtown, Sterling Commons in Tempe, Sterling Heights in Paradise Valley. The name Sterling meant something in this state. It meant integrity, success, and family values. My older sons understood this legacy. Marcus, 32, ran our commercial division with the precision of a Swiss watch. Every deal he touched turned to gold. Stephen, 29, managed residential developments and had tripled our profits in 5 years. They wore tailored suits, drove German cars, and spoke the language of success. Board meetings, golf with city councilmen, charity galas, they knew how to represent the Sterling name. Then there was Danny, 25 years old and still acting like a teenager. While his brothers discussed quarterly projections over dinner, Danny would show up in work boots and oil-stained jeans, talking about some employee's sick kid or a family facing foreclosure. He never understood that business required tough decisions. Sentiment was expensive, and I hadn't built an empire by being soft. The disappointment cut deep because I'd seen potential in him once. Danny had a natural way with people, a genuine concern that could have made him an excellent property manager or community liaison. But he refused to focus on profits, refused to see the bigger picture. Instead, he befriended janitors and worried about health insurance for part-time workers. When the $50,000 went missing from our employee assistance fund, all evidence pointed to Danny. He'd had access. He'd been asking questions about terminated employees, and he couldn't explain his whereabouts during the time frame. Worse, when I confronted him, he didn't even deny it. Just stood there in my office, looking at me with those disappointed eyes, like I was the one who'd done something wrong. "Dad, you don't understand," was all he said, but I understood perfectly. My youngest son had chosen to steal from his own family, the family that had given him everything, education, opportunities, a future, and he threw it away for what? To help some strangers who couldn't manage their own finances? Marcus and Stephen had been professional throughout the ordeal. They'd discovered the discrepancy during a routine audit, reported it immediately, and even offered to cover the loss from their own bonuses. Their loyalty to the company, to me, stood in sharp contrast to Danny's betrayal. The day I expelled him still haunts my memory. Danny packed a single duffel bag, said goodbye to Maria, our housekeeper, and walked out without looking back. No anger, no arguments, no pleas for forgiveness. Just quiet acceptance like he'd been expecting it all along. That should have been the end of it. Sterling real estate continued growing. Marcus secured a major development deal in Tucson. Stephen's residential projects won city planning awards. The business thrived without Danny's misguided compassion interfering with hard decisions. But sometimes, late at night in my Camelback Mountain estate, I'd walk past Danny's old room. Maria had cleaned it thoroughly, but she'd left some boxes in the closet. College textbooks, old photographs, notebooks filled with his careful handwriting. I never looked through them. What was the point? Danny had made his choice, and I'd made mine. Until yesterday, when something made me finally open one of those notebooks. I need to tell you about who Danny really was, before I destroyed everything between us with my blind assumptions. The truth lives in memories I've been avoiding for 2 years, scenes that now burn with different meaning. Danny was always different from his brothers. While Marcus collected baseball cards by their market value and Stephen organized neighborhood kids into profit-making ventures, Danny brought home stray cats and gave away his lunch money to classmates who couldn't afford cafeteria food. My late wife Sarah used to say Danny had the softest heart in Phoenix, but I worried that softness would crush him in the business world. In high school, Danny volunteered at homeless shelters while his brothers focused on grades that would get them into Arizona State's business program. When Marcus made varsity football, Danny tutored struggling students for free. Stephen joined student government, Danny organized food drives, different paths, but I kept hoping Danny would eventually see that success required harder choices. After college, when Danny joined Sterling Real Estate, the differences became more pronounced. His brothers arrived early, stayed late, and discussed strategies over weekend golf. Danny would disappear during lunch to visit former employees who'd been let go during restructuring. He knew every janitor's name, every security guard's family situation, every receptionist's personal struggles. "Dad, Mrs. Martinez can't afford her insulin anymore," he'd tell me after we'd had to reduce our part-time staff benefits. "Tommy Rodriguez's kid needs surgery, and his insurance got canceled when we cut him to 28 hours. Business was business, I'd remind him. We couldn't be responsible for everyone's personal problems. Sterling Real Estate had shareholders to answer to, growth targets to meet, competitive pressures to handle. Sentiment was expensive, and our competitors weren't worried about every former employee's medical bills. But Danny never learned that lesson. He'd show up to board meetings with detailed reports about employee satisfaction surveys while Marcus presented acquisition opportunities and Stephen outlined cost-cutting, measures that would increase our quarterly margins by 12%. The morning, everything changed, started like any other. Danny had been asking questions about our recent workforce reductions, specifically about families who'd lost their health insurance when we'd had to make some difficult staffing decisions. Marcus and Stephen had identified several positions where we could consolidate responsibilities, saving the company nearly $200,000 annually in benefits alone. Those people gave us years of loyal service, Danny had argued during our monthly family business meeting. We can't just cut them loose without transition support. We gave them honest work for honest pay, I'd replied. That's the extent of our obligation. Danny's face had shown that familiar disappointment, the look that said I was failing some test he'd never explained. But business required tough decisions. I'd built Sterling Real Estate by understanding that emotions couldn't drive financial choices. 3 days later, Marcus discovered the $50,000 missing from our Employee Assistance Fund. The fund was designed for current employees facing genuine emergencies, not former staff who'd been professionally transitioned out of the company. Danny had access through his administrative duties, and the timeline matched his recent concerns about terminated workers. When I confronted him in my corner office overlooking downtown Phoenix, Danny didn't deny anything. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, looking more tired than guilty. "Dad, you don't understand what's really happening here," he said quietly. "I understand that you took money that wasn't yours to take," I'd replied. "I understand that you betrayed your family and your company for people who are no longer our responsibility." Danny had looked at me for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Not anger, but something sadder. Resignation, maybe. "You're right," he'd said finally. "I took the money. I used it to help people who needed it more than we needed it sitting in an account. No excuses, no justifications, no pleas for understanding. Just quiet admission and acceptance of consequences." Even his brothers had seemed surprised by how calmly Danny accepted his expulsion. The last thing he said before leaving was, "Take care of yourself, Dad, and watch out for the people you trust." I thought he was being dramatic, maybe trying to deflect guilt onto others. Now, staring at his notebooks, I'm beginning to understand what he really meant. While I was disappointed in Danny, I took pride in Marcus and Stephen. They understood business, respected the bottom line, and knew how to make difficult decisions without emotional interference. They were everything I'd hoped my sons would become, until I learned what they really were. Marcus had joined Sterling Real Estate straight from Arizona State with an MBA and clear vision. He streamlined our commercial division, negotiated better contractor rates, and identified properties with genuine development potential. His deals were clean, profitable, and consistently successful. City councilmen respected him, banks competed for his business, and competitors studied his strategies. Stephen brought similar excellence to residential development. He could spot neighborhoods ready for gentrification 2 years before anyone else, secure permits that others couldn't get, and deliver projects under budget and ahead of schedule. His developments won architectural awards and sold out before construction finished. Together, they'd increased Sterling Real Estate's annual revenue by 43% in 5 years. Board meetings became showcases for their achievements, Marcus presenting acquisition opportunities that would expand our commercial footprint, Stephen outlining residential projects that would establish Sterling as Phoenix's premier luxury developer. What I didn't know was how they were achieving these remarkable results. Marcus had created a network of shell companies: Sterling Management Solutions, Desert Property Services, Arizona Development Partners, all with different tax ID numbers but the same ownership structure. These companies would bid on Sterling Real Estate contracts, always winning with competitive proposals that seemed legitimate on paper. The genius was in the markup. A bathroom renovation that should cost $12,000 would get billed at $18,000, with the extra $6,000 flowing back through the shell companies into Marcus's personal accounts. Landscaping projects doubled in price, security services tripled, and maintenance contracts became gold mines of artificial inflation. Stephen's scheme was more sophisticated. He'd identify families in financial distress, particularly those facing medical emergencies or job losses, and offer to buy their homes at below-market prices as compassionate quick sales. Sterling Residential would purchase these properties through subsidiary companies, then flip them to Sterling Development for massive profits that never appeared on our main books. The families thought they were getting rescue from financial disaster. Sterling Real Estate's official records showed modest, legitimate transactions. But Stephen was systematically exploiting people's desperation, turning human suffering into hidden profits while maintaining his reputation as an ethical developer. Both brothers had learned to game our employee assistance fund, too. They'd approve emergency loans for fictional employees, then channel that money through their network of fake companies. The paperwork looked legitimate. The recipients seemed real. But everything was manufactured to justify transfers that ultimately enriched them personally. Their most cruel innovation involved our health insurance policies. They'd identify long-term employees approaching retirement or dealing with expensive medical conditions, then manufacture justifications to reduce their hours below the threshold for benefits eligibility. Families would lose coverage exactly when they needed it most, while Sterling Real Estate saved thousands monthly in premium costs. Marcus would present these efficiency improvements during board meetings, showing charts that demonstrated reduced labor costs and increased profit margins. Stephen would add supporting data about workforce optimization and competitive positioning. I'd approve their recommendations, believing I was making sound business decisions. The employees who suffered these reductions, they'd appeal to Danny, knowing his reputation for caring about worker welfare. Danny would try to help them navigate the appeals process, research alternative insurance options, and sometimes use his own money to bridge gaps in their medical coverage. I'd interpreted Danny's advocacy as dangerous sentimentality that could expose the company to liability. His brothers had encouraged this interpretation, suggesting that Danny's bleeding heart approach could undermine necessary business decisions and set expensive precedents for employee expectations. "We can't let emotion drive policy," Marcus would say during family dinners. Danny means well, but kindness without boundaries becomes weakness. Stephen would add supporting observations about competitive pressures and shareholder expectations, reinforcing my belief that business required harder choices than Danny was willing to make. They were systematically stealing millions while positioning themselves as pragmatic leaders and Danny as a naive idealist whose compassion threatened company success. Every time Danny questioned a policy or advocated for an employee, Marcus and Stephen would exchange meaningful looks that said, "See, this is exactly the problem we've been discussing." The morning Danny took the $50,000, Marcus had been the one to discover it. He'd called me immediately, expressing appropriate shock and disappointment. Stephen had supported his brother's account, providing timeline details and access records that made Danny's guilt seem obvious. Both had offered to cover the loss from their own compensation, a gesture that reinforced my faith in their integrity while highlighting Danny's betrayal. They'd handled the whole situation with professionalism that made Danny's silence seem like stubborn guilt rather than principled refusal to explain himself. Now I understand. Danny had discovered their schemes and was trying to help the people they'd systematically exploited, using company money to provide the support Sterling Real Estate should have provided legitimately. The notebook I found in Danny's closet changed everything I thought I knew about my youngest son. Written in his careful handwriting, it contained records that revealed not a thief, but a guardian angel I'd been too blind to recognize. The first page was dated 18 months before his expulsion. Employee Medical Crisis Documentation, Sterling Real Estate Moral Obligations. Below that, a list of names I recognized, former employees who'd been transitioned out during our efficiency improvements. Rodriguez, Tommy, 8 years custodial, son needs cardiac surgery. Insurance canceled when hours reduced to 27-week. Surgery cost, $89,000. Family considering bankruptcy. Martinez, Elena, 12 years administrative diabetes management. Prescription coverage ended with benefits reduction. Monthly insulin cost, $847. Rationing medication, hospitalized twice. Johnson, Robert Sr., 15 years maintenance, wife's cancer treatment. COBRA payments too expensive after position elimination. Oncology appointments stopped. Prognosis declining. Page after page documented human costs of business decisions I'd approved without considering individual consequences. Danny hadn't just noticed these situations. He'd researched them thoroughly, calculating medical expenses, investigating insurance alternatives, and tracking family financial situations with accountant-level precision. But the documentation went deeper. Danny had been conducting his own investigation into company finances, trying to understand why profitable Sterling Real Estate couldn't afford employee health care while executives received increasing bonuses. Shell Company Analysis. Suspicious. Contractor relationships filled an entire section. Danny had identified patterns in our vendor contracts, noting inflated prices and mysterious subsidiary companies that didn't appear in public business registrations. His accounting was meticulous, comparing market rates for services with Sterling Real Estate's contracted costs, calculating unexplained markup percentages, and tracing money flows through corporate structures. Marcus's Desert Property Services charged $47,000 for lobby renovation work. Identical renovations at comparable buildings, $28,000, $31,000 average. Markup 58.67%. DPS shares business address with Marcus's personal investment company. Stevens Arizona Development Partners acquired Flores family property for $127,000, family facing medical bankruptcy. Resold to Sterling Development for $268,000 6 weeks later. Markup 111%. Flores family unaware of resale value. Danny had spent months documenting what appeared to be systematic financial manipulation, creating detailed evidence of artificial cost inflation and hidden profit transfers. But his investigation wasn't motivated by jealousy or ambition. It was driven by concern for employees suffering while company resources disappeared into concealed accounts. The most heartbreaking section was titled Personal Assistance. Record. Ethical Obligation Fulfillment. Here, Danny had documented every dollar he'd spent helping families affected by Sterling Real Estate's cost-cutting measures. Rodriguez family, $8,200 toward surgery down payment. December 15th, son's operation successful. Family establishing payment plan for remaining balance. Martinez, Elena, $1,847 monthly insulin costs, January-March. Diabetes stabilized. Emergency room visits eliminated. Johnson family, $3,200 toward continuation of cancer treatment. Mrs. Johnson's oncologist reports positive response to resumed chemotherapy. The $50,000 hadn't been stolen. It had been redistributed to families facing medical crises that Sterling Real Estates policies had created or worsened. Danny had used company money to fulfill what he saw as company obligations, providing health care support that our official policies had systematically eliminated. But there was more. Danny had been preparing a comprehensive report for me, documenting both the employee medical situations and his brother's apparent financial schemes. The report was titled, Protecting Sterling Real Estate: Integrity, Recommendations for Ethical Business Practices. His plan was to present evidence of employee suffering alongside evidence of executive financial manipulation, hoping to convince me that Sterling Real Estate could afford ethical treatment of workers if we eliminated hidden profit transfers to shell companies. Dad believes in integrity, Danny had written in his personal notes section. If he understands what's really happening, he'll make the right choices. Sterling Real Estate can be profitable and ethical. We just need to stop the money from disappearing into fake companies. The final entry was dated 2 days before his expulsion. Took $50,000 from Employee Assistance Fund. Families can't wait for formal investigation. Rodriguez kid needs surgery next week. Martinez hasn't had proper insulin in 2 months. Johnson family about to lose house while paying for cancer treatment. We'll explain everything to Dad after people are safe. Danny had been protecting me. He discovered that my trusted older sons were criminals, but instead of immediately exposing them, he'd chosen to help their victims first. He'd used company money to provide medical assistance that Sterling Real Estate should have provided legitimately, planning to reveal the complete truth once families were stabilized. But Marcus and Stephen had discovered his activities first, manufactured evidence that made him appear guilty, and positioned themselves as loyal sons reporting their brother's theft. Danny had found himself trapped, unable to explain his actions without exposing crimes that would destroy the family business, destroy me, and potentially send his brothers to prison. So he'd remained silent, accepting expulsion rather than destroying everything I'd built, even though that silence meant sacrificing his reputation and his relationship with me. For 2 years, while I'd grieved the son I thought had betrayed me, Danny had been living quietly in Phoenix, working as a mechanic, continuing to help people when he could, and protecting a father who'd thrown him away. 3 weeks after discovering Danny's notebooks, my world began crumbling in ways I never could have anticipated. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing quarterly projections in my Camelback Mountain office, still processing the devastating truth about my sons. Mr. Sterling, this is Agent Patricia Hensley with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. We need to schedule a meeting regarding Sterling Real Estate's financial records. Federal audit. The words every business owner dreads, but I'd always maintained clean books and proper documentation. Sterling Real Estate had passed previous audits without issues. This should have been routine, except now I knew my books weren't as clean as I'd believed. Agent Hensley arrived the next morning with 2 colleagues and boxes of documents I didn't recognize. Tall, professional, with the kind of methodical precision that made me immediately nervous. She spread financial records across my conference table like evidence at a crime scene. We've identified approximately $45 million in questionable transactions over the past 4 years, she announced without preamble. Shell companies, inflated contractor agreements, artificial property valuations, and fraudulent employee assistance claims. $45 million. The number hit like a physical blow. I'd suspected Marcus and Stephen of some financial manipulation based on Danny's notebooks, but the scope was staggering. Nearly 1/10 of our total company value had disappeared through schemes I'd been too trusting to detect. Mr. Sterling, are you familiar with Desert Property Services, Arizona Development Partners, or Sterling Management Solutions? I wasn't. These were Marcus and Stephen's creations, companies that existed on paper to facilitate their theft while keeping their crimes hidden from my oversight. They'd been systematically looting Sterling Real Estate while presenting themselves as model executives, increasing company profitability. Agent Hensley showed me contractor agreements I'd never seen, property transfers that bypassed normal approval processes, and employee records for people who didn't exist. Every document bore forged signatures or approvals that had been processed through administrative channels I didn't personally monitor. Your sons, Marcus and Stephen Sterling, appear to have created an elaborate network of fraudulent transactions, Agent Hensley continued. They've been billing Sterling Real Estate for services never performed, purchasing properties at artificially low prices through subsidiary companies, and claiming employee assistance payments for fictional recipients. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank transfers, tax documents, corporate filings, everything Danny had suspected and more. Marcus and Stephen hadn't just been stealing. They'd been running a sophisticated criminal enterprise using Sterling Real Estate as their cover. We'll need complete access to your financial systems and cooperation with our ongoing investigation, Agent Hensley explained. Based on preliminary analysis, this appears to be organized fraud that could result in federal charges including money laundering, tax evasion, and wire fraud. Federal charges. My sons, the ones I'd trusted, the ones I'd believed were building our family, legacy, were facing potential prison sentences, while the son I'd expelled had been trying to protect me from exactly this situation when I called Marcus to inform him about the federal investigation. His response revealed everything I needed to know about his character. No surprise, no confusion, no questions about what the agents might have found. Just immediate defensiveness and careful word choices that sounded like someone who'd been preparing for this conversation. "Dad, you know how these federal fishing expeditions work," he said smoothly. "They find some accounting discrepancies and try to make them sound criminal. Our books are solid. We've just been aggressive about maximizing profitability." Which isn't illegal. Stephen's reaction was identical. Prepared. Responses that avoided direct denials while suggesting the investigation was politically motivated or based on misunderstandings of legitimate business practices. Neither asked what specific evidence the agents had found, which told me they already knew exactly what had been discovered. Over the following days, I watched my sons operate in crisis mode. Hushed phone conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, urgent meetings with attorneys I hadn't hired, and document destruction that they claimed was routine file management, but looked suspiciously like evidence elimination. Meanwhile, Danny remained unaware that vindication was coming. Agent Hensley had asked me not to contact family members during the initial investigation phase, so Danny continued working at Rodriguez Auto Repair, living modestly and helping people when he could. He had no idea that federal agents were proving everything he'd documented in his notebooks. The irony was devastating. For 2 years, I'd mourned the loss of a son I believed had betrayed me, while the sons I'd trusted were committing crimes that could destroy everything our family had built. Danny had been protecting me from criminals who shared my DNA and my business legacy. Agent Hensley's investigation moved quickly. Bank records confirmed artificial transactions, property assessments revealed manipulated valuations, and contractor interviews exposed the shell company schemes. Within 2 weeks, the evidence was sufficient for federal charges. "Mr. Sterling, we'll be executing arrest warrants tomorrow morning," Agent Hensley informed me during our final interview. "Marcus and Stephen Sterling will be charged with conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. We recommend you distance Sterling Real Estate from their activities immediately." That night, I sat in my office overlooking downtown Phoenix, staring at Danny's notebooks and realizing the complete scope of my failure as a father. I'd expelled an innocent son and embraced criminals. I'd believed lies and rejected truth. I'd destroyed the relationship that mattered most while protecting the ones that were destroying me. Tomorrow, my older sons would be arrested. The Sterling name would be associated with federal crimes and corporate fraud. And somewhere in Phoenix, Danny would learn that his sacrifice had been vindicated, but possibly too late for forgiveness. The night before Marcus and Stephen's arrest, I couldn't sleep. Federal agents would arrive in the morning to take away my sons. Not all my sons, but the 2 I'd called successful while casting out the one who'd tried to save me. I found myself back in Danny's old room at 3 a.m., reading his notebooks again, seeing details I'd missed the first time. Danny's documentation wasn't just evidence of his brother's crimes, it was a love letter to a father who'd failed him completely. Every page showed his desperate attempts to protect me, Sterling Real Estate, and the employees who'd suffered from policies I'd approved without understanding their real impact. Investigation. Timeline. Protecting Dad's legacy was written in Danny's careful handwriting at the top of a section I hadn't fully examined before. What I found there shattered whatever remained of my heart. Danny had first noticed financial irregularities 8 months before his expulsion. Small discrepancies that didn't make sense. Contractor bills slightly higher than comparable services. Property acquisitions that seemed overpriced. Employee assistance payments for people he couldn't locate in our personnel files. Instead of immediately confronting Marcus and Stephen, Danny had begun his own quiet investigation. He'd researched every suspicious transaction, cross-referenced vendor information with public records, and tracked money flows through corporate databases. His accounting was more thorough than our professional auditors had ever provided. Month 1-2. Documenting patterns. Marcus's companies consistently win bids 15 to 20% higher than competitors. Stephen's property acquisitions show unusual pricing structures. Need more evidence before approaching Dad. Danny had been protecting me from painful truths, hoping to gather sufficient evidence to present solutions rather than just problems. He'd known that accusing his brothers without overwhelming proof would force me to choose sides, potentially destroying family relationships without achieving justice. Month 3-4. Shell Company Network identified. Desert Property Services, Arizona Development Partners, Sterling Management Solutions. All traced back to Marcus Stephen personal accounts. Estimated theft, $2.8 million annually. Dad would be devastated if he knew. But Danny's investigation had uncovered something worse than financial theft. Marcus and Stephen had been systematically targeting vulnerable employees, reducing their hours to eliminate health care benefits exactly when families faced medical crises. The timing wasn't coincidental. It was calculated cruelty designed to maximize cost savings while employees were least able to fight back. Martinez family. Elena's diabetes diagnosis coincided with our reduction. Marcus knew about medical condition from insurance claims, used it to justify cutting her benefits. She's rationing insulin to afford rent. Johnson family. Robert Sr.'s wife, diagnosed with cancer, immediately reassigned to part-time status. Stephen personally approved the change. 3 days after insurance filed first oncology. Claim, Danny had realized, that our efficiency improvements weren't just business decisions. They were targeted attacks on families facing health emergencies. His brothers were weaponizing human suffering to inflate profit margins, while maintaining plausible deniability about their motivations. The notebooks showed Danny's growing desperation as he watched families deteriorate while gathering evidence. He'd used his own money to help when possible, but his mechanic's salary couldn't address medical expenses that reached tens of thousands of dollars. Meanwhile, his investigation revealed that Marcus and Stephen were stealing enough money monthly to provide health care for every affected family with millions left over. Month 6. Can't wait much longer. Rodriguez kid needs surgery soon or permanent heart damage. Martinez hospitalized twice from insulin rationing. Mrs. Johnson's cancer spreading without treatment. Have to choose between protecting Dad's feelings and saving lives. Danny had chosen lives. He'd taken $50,000 from the Employee Assistance Fund. Money that Marcus and Stephen had been stealing through fake claims anyway. And provided immediate medical support to families who couldn't wait for a formal investigation to conclude. But his brothers had been monitoring the fund, possibly because it was one of their fraud mechanisms. They'd discovered Danny's withdrawals and realized their financial schemes were at risk of exposure. Moving quickly, they'd manufactured evidence to make Danny appear guilty while positioning themselves as loyal sons reporting their brother's theft. The final notebook entry was the most heartbreaking. They're going to blame me for everything. Found Marcus searching my office, Stephen asking questions about my research. They know I discovered their crimes, and they're preparing to sacrifice me to protect themselves. Could expose everything now, but Dad isn't ready. He loves them, trusts them, built his legacy around them. Learning the truth would destroy him. Better to accept blame and let him discover gradually when he's stronger. Danny had chosen to protect me even from the pain of learning the truth too quickly. He'd accepted expulsion, damaged reputation, and family exile rather than devastate me with immediate knowledge that my trusted sons were criminals who'd been systematically exploiting vulnerable people for personal profit. For 2 years, while I'd grieved what I thought was Danny's betrayal, he'd been working quietly in Phoenix, continuing to help people when possible, and waiting for truth to emerge naturally. He'd sacrificed everything to protect a father who'd chosen criminals over him, never defending himself because he knew the complete truth would be more than I could handle. Looking through police records from the night I expelled him, I found something that broke me completely. Danny had been arrested that same evening. Not for theft, but for paying Tommy Rodriguez's emergency room bill when the 8-year-old had been brought in with cardiac distress. Danny had used his last $300 to ensure the boy received immediate treatment. He'd gone from being expelled by his father for allegedly stealing money to spending his remaining cash helping the very people he'd been accused of stealing from. Even facing homelessness and family rejection, Danny's first priority had been continuing to help families affected by his brother's crimes. The son I'd called a disappointment had been a hero all along. The FBI arrived at Sterling Real Estate headquarters at exactly 7:30 a.m. on a Thursday morning that would forever divide my life into before and after. I watched from my office window as federal agents approached the building with the methodical precision of people who'd done this many times before. Marcus arrived first, stepping out of his black BMW with the confident stride of someone who believed his wealth and connections provided protection from consequences. He'd dressed carefully, navy suit, silk tie, Italian leather shoes, looking every inch the successful executive he'd pretended to be while systematically stealing millions from our company. Stephen pulled into the parking lot 3 minutes later, driving the Mercedes convertible he'd purchased with money stolen from families facing medical bankruptcies. He moved with the same easy confidence as his brother, checking his phone and adjusting his tie like this was another routine business meeting. Neither suspected what was about to happen. They'd become so comfortable with their criminal enterprise, so confident in their ability to manipulate evidence and control narratives, that they'd failed to recognize how thoroughly federal investigators had documented their crimes. I met them in the lobby, something heavy settling in my chest as I looked at these two men who'd shared my DNA and my business legacy while betraying everything I'd tried to teach them about integrity and family responsibility. "Dad, what's with all the federal cars outside?" Marcus asked, his tone suggesting mild curiosity rather than concern. "Are they auditing the Johnson Project permits?" Stephen added, "Hope this doesn't delay our Tucson expansion timeline. We can't afford regulatory interference when we're moving so aggressively into new markets." They were still performing their roles as dedicated sons concerned about business operations, maintaining their facade even as federal agents prepared to arrest them for organized fraud. The casual way they discussed timelines and expansion plans while surrounded by evidence of their crimes showed how completely they'd compartmentalized their criminal activities. Agent Hensley entered the lobby at exactly 7:45 a.m., followed by 6 other federal agents and 2 Phoenix Police Department detectives. The sight of that much law enforcement presence finally registered with Marcus and Stephen, and I watched their expressions change from confident curiosity to careful concern. Marcus Sterling and Stephen Sterling, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and wire fraud, Agent Hensley announced, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority. The transformation in my sons was immediate and revealing. Gone was the executive confidence, replaced by the calculated responses of people who'd been preparing for this possibility. No surprise, no confusion, no questions about what charges meant, just immediate demands for attorneys and careful silence about anything substantive. Marcus's first words were, "I want to speak with Jonathan Reeves immediately," referring to the high-priced criminal defense attorney he'd apparently already retained. Stephen added, "We're not discussing anything without legal representation present. suggesting they'd coordinated their response to potential arrest. As federal agents read them their rights, I thought about Danny working at Rodriguez Auto Repair, unaware that his vindication was happening 40 miles across Phoenix. For 2 years, he'd lived with the knowledge that his father had chosen criminals over him, while Marcus and Stephen had continued stealing millions and receiving praise for their business acumen. The media arrived within an hour. Sterling real estate executives arrested in federal fraud investigation became the leading story on every Phoenix news station. Reporters described a $45 million scheme involving shell companies, property manipulation, and fraudulent employee assistance claims. What they didn't report, because they didn't know, was that Danny had documented everything years earlier, trying to protect both the company and the families being victimized by his brother's systematic cruelty. He'd sacrificed his relationship with me rather than immediately expose crimes that would devastate Sterling real estate and send his brothers to prison. By afternoon, Sterling Real Estate's stock price had dropped 63%. Clients were canceling contracts, banks were freezing credit lines, and employees were updating their resumes. The company I'd spent 43 years building was collapsing because the sons I'd trusted had been using it as a criminal enterprise, but the financial damage was nothing compared to the personal devastation. Marcus and Stephen weren't just facing federal charges. They were looking at potential sentences of 15 to 25 years in federal prison. Everything they'd stolen, every family they'd exploited, every lie they'd told was now documented evidence in a criminal case that would destroy their lives completely. That evening, I drove to Danny's apartment complex in Maryvale, a working-class neighborhood where he'd been living since his expulsion. The contrast was stark. From the Camelback Mountain estate where he'd grown up to a modest one-bedroom apartment near the auto repair shop where he worked as a mechanic. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, trying to find words adequate for the situation. How do you apologize to a son you've wronged so completely? How do you explain that you chose criminals over him because you were too proud and too blind to recognize truth when it was standing in front of you? Danny's truck was in the parking lot, the same Ford F-150 he'd driven in high school, now showing rust and wear from 2 years of honest work while his brothers had driven luxury cars purchased with stolen money. He'd been living authentically while they'd been living lies, maintaining his integrity while they'd been destroying everything our family name had once represented. Tomorrow, I'd have to face him and somehow find words for an apology that could never be adequate. But tonight, I sat in that parking lot and grieved for all the time we'd lost, all the conversations we'd never had, and all the ways I'd failed the son who'd tried to save me from the sons who'd been destroying me. The Golden Boys had fallen, and their true nature was finally exposed. Now I had to discover if there was any possibility of redemption for a father who'd chosen wrong so completely. Rodriguez Auto Repair sat on a busy stretch of Van Buren Street, the kind of honest working-class business that built communities one satisfied customer at a time. I'd driven past this neighborhood countless times without really seeing it, but now I understood this was where my son had rebuilt his life after I'd destroyed it. The shop was busy for a Thursday afternoon. 2 cars on lifts, another waiting for service, and customers discussing repair estimates with obvious trust in the recommendations they were receiving. Through the office window, I could see Danny explaining something to an elderly Hispanic woman, his manner patient and respectful in a way that reminded me of his mother. Danny looked different than I remembered. 2 years of physical work had filled out his frame, and his face showed the kind of quiet confidence that comes from earning respect through honest labor rather than inherited position. He wore coveralls with Danny embroidered over the pocket, working-class armor that suited him better than the business clothes I'd once insisted he wear. When he finally noticed me standing beside my Mercedes in the customer parking area, Danny's expression shifted through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been resignation. He excused himself from his conversation and walked toward me, moving with the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment from family encounters. "Hello, Dad," he said quietly. "I heard about Marcus and Stephen on the news. I'm sorry." Even now, facing the father who'd expelled him unjustly, Danny's first response was sympathy for my pain. He was sorry that I was hurting, sorry that my world had collapsed, sorry that the sons I'd trusted had turned out to be criminals. No accusation, no bitterness, no demand for vindication, just genuine concern for my welfare. "Danny, I need to talk to you," I managed to say. "I found your notebooks. I know what really happened." Something flickered across his face, not relief or satisfaction, but a kind of tired sadness that suggested he'd long ago stopped hoping for this conversation. "I'm working until 6, he said. "If you want to wait, we can talk after I close up." I waited. For 3 hours, I sat in my car watching Danny work, consulting with customers, training a younger mechanic, handling the business relationships that sustained this modest operation. Everyone who interacted with him showed obvious respect and trust, the kind of reputation that takes years to build and can't be faked or purchased. At 6:15, Danny emerged from the shop in clean clothes, having showered and changed in the employee facility. He looked like he was preparing for something difficult, the way people dress carefully for funerals or court appearances. "There's a diner around the corner," he said. "We can talk there." The Sunrise Cafe was exactly the kind of place Danny would choose. Honest food, working-class clientele, an environment where conversations happened without pretense or performance. We took a corner booth where we could speak privately, and I found myself studying this son I'd misjudged so completely. "I owe you an apology that can never be adequate," I began, but Danny raised a hand to stop me. "Dad, you don't need to apologize for protecting the family business," he said. "I took money without authorization. Technically, that's theft, regardless of my motivations." "But you were helping people that Marcus and Stephen had systematically exploited," I replied. "You were trying to save families while documenting crimes that I was too blind to see." Danny looked out the window for a long moment before responding. "I was hoping you'd discover the truth gradually when you were ready to handle it. I never wanted you to learn that your sons were criminals by having federal agents arrest them on television." The pain in his voice was devastating. Danny had been protecting me even from the emotional trauma of learning the truth, hoping I'd uncover his brother's crimes naturally rather than through federal intervention. He'd sacrificed his relationship with me to spare me the shock of immediate revelation. "Why didn't you defend yourself?" I asked. "Why didn't you explain what the money was really for?" "Because you weren't ready to believe that Marcus and Stephen were stealing millions while families lost their health insurance," Danny replied. "You loved them, trusted them, built your legacy around them. Learning the complete truth would have destroyed you, and I couldn't do that to my father. He'd chosen my emotional welfare over his own vindication, accepting expulsion and family rejection rather than devastate me with evidence that my trusted sons were criminals." Even facing homelessness and professional exile, Danny's priority had been protecting his father's heart. "I've been living with the knowledge that I chose criminals over you," I said, "that I expelled an innocent son while embracing the ones who were destroying everything I'd built." "Dad, you made the best decision you could with the information you had," Danny responded. "Marcus and Stephen are sophisticated criminals who spent years perfecting their deception. They fooled banks, auditors, and federal regulators. It's not surprising they fooled their father. Even now, Danny was offering me absolution I didn't deserve, explaining my failures in terms that preserved my dignity while accepting responsibility he'd never deserved. His generosity toward someone who'd wronged him so completely was almost unbearable to witness. "I want to make this right," I said. "I want to restore your position in the company, give you the recognition you deserve, and somehow compensate for 2 years of injustice." Danny was quiet for several minutes, considering my offer with the same careful thought he'd always brought to important decisions. "The Sterling name is going to be associated with federal crimes for years," he said finally. "The company might not survive the scandal, the legal expenses, and the reputation damage. Are you sure you want to rebuild something that might be beyond saving?" It was a practical question that showed Danny understood business realities better than I'd ever given him credit for. But it was also a test. Was I offering reconciliation because I genuinely valued our relationship, or because I needed his help salvaging a damaged enterprise? "I want my son back," I said. "Everything else is secondary. For the first time since I'd arrived, Danny smiled, not the careful neutrality he'd maintained, but something genuine that reminded me of the boy who'd once brought home stray cats and worried about classmates who couldn't afford lunch. "Then let's figure out how to move forward together," he said. "Rebuilding trust between a father and son requires more than apologies and good intentions. It demands honest confrontation. With years of accumulated pain and systematic reconstruction of emotional foundations that pride and misjudgment had destroyed, Danny and I met twice weekly for dinner, usually at working-class restaurants in neighborhoods I'd never previously visited. These weren't business meetings or formal reconciliation sessions, but tentative attempts to rediscover each other as people rather than the roles family dynamics had imposed on us. Our first real conversation happened at a Mexican restaurant near Danny's apartment, 3 weeks after Marcus and Stephen's arrest. The federal case was proceeding methodically, with prosecutors building evidence that would likely result in lengthy prison sentences. Meanwhile, Sterling Real Estate was hemorrhaging clients, fighting civil lawsuits and facing potential bankruptcy. "I need you to understand how much damage I caused," I told Danny over plates of food that reminded me his mother had always preferred authentic cuisine to the expensive restaurants I'd favored for business dinners. "Dad, you were manipulated by sophisticated criminals who happened to share your DNA," Danny replied. "They spent years perfecting their deception, creating evidence that made me appear guilty while positioning themselves as loyal sons. You responded to manufactured evidence exactly as they intended. But I needed him to understand the complete scope of my failure, not just the expulsion itself, but the years of dismissed concerns, ignored insights, and systematic preference for sons who'd been lying to me consistently. I chose them over you repeatedly. Long before the money went missing," I said. "Every time you advocated for employees, I treated it as naive sentimentality. Every time you questioned business practices, I saw it as disloyalty to family interests. I trained myself to ignore your moral compass, because it conflicted with the aggressive profit maximization I thought defined successful business." Danny listened without defending my choices or minimizing my responsibility, allowing me to process guilt I'd been carrying since discovering his notebooks. This wasn't absolution he was offering, but patient space for me to confront the father I'd been and the father I wanted to become. "The hardest part," Danny said eventually, "wasn't being expelled or losing my position in the company. It was watching you trust people who were systematically exploiting the families I was trying to help. Marcus and Stephen weren't just stealing money. They were weaponizing human suffering for personal profit while maintaining reputations as ethical businessmen." The pain in his voice was devastating. Danny had been forced to watch his father embrace criminals who were torturing vulnerable families, unable to expose them without destroying everything I'd worked to build. His silence hadn't been stubborn guilt. It had been agonizing sacrifice to protect me from truths I wasn't ready to handle. "I should have seen who they really were," I said. "I should have recognized your character instead of being impressed by their performance." "Dad, they were performing for you specifically," Danny replied. "Everything they said and did was calculated to reinforce your beliefs about successful business practices. They told you what you wanted to hear about competitive advantage and profit, maximization while hiding the criminal methods they were using to achieve those results. Our conversations gradually moved beyond the immediate crisis toward deeper questions about family, business ethics, and the legacy we wanted to build together. Danny had spent 2 years thinking about these issues while working as a mechanic, developing perspectives that combined moral clarity with practical understanding of economic realities. "Sterling Real Estate could survive the scandal," he said during one particularly difficult discussion, "but only if we completely transform how we operate, prioritizing employee welfare, community benefit, and ethical practices over maximum profit extraction. It was a radical proposition that would require abandoning the aggressive growth strategies that had built our wealth while embracing values that Danny had always advocated but I'd consistently dismissed as commercially naive. Would you consider returning to help? Rebuild the company along those lines?" I asked. Danny was quiet for several minutes, considering implications that went far beyond business operations to questions of family relationships, public perception, and personal integrity. "I'd want to start with the families that Marcus and Stephen exploited," he said finally. "Before we focus on corporate recovery, we need to address the human damage our policies created. That means restoring health insurance for terminated employees, covering medical expenses that people couldn't afford because of our cost-cutting measures, and providing transition support that treats people as human beings, rather than disposable resources." It was an expensive proposition that would require significant capital investment during a period when Sterling Real Estate was already facing financial stress from legal expenses and lost revenue. But it was also the right thing to do, and Danny's moral clarity was exactly what the company needed to rebuild credibility and community trust. "I also want complete financial transparency," Danny continued. "No shell companies, no hidden transactions, no artificial profit manipulations. Every dollar we spend and every dollar we earn should be documented in ways that employees, clients, and regulatory agencies can verify." These weren't just business reforms. They were acknowledgments that Sterling Real Estate had been built on practices that enabled systematic exploitation and fraud. Rebuilding would require admitting fault, accepting responsibility, and committing to standards that prioritized integrity over profit maximization. Over 6 months of weekly dinners, Danny and I slowly reconstructed our relationship while developing plans for ethical business operations that would honor both community welfare and family legacy. It wasn't easy reconciliation. Trust, damaged by years of misjudgment, required patient rebuilding through consistent actions rather than dramatic gestures. But gradually, I began to recognize the son I'd always had but had been too blind to appreciate. Danny's moral courage, practical wisdom, and genuine concern for other people's welfare weren't character flaws that interfered with business success. They were strengths that could transform Sterling Real Estate into the kind of company that built communities rather than exploiting them. 1 year after Marcus and Stephen began serving their federal sentences, 15 and 17 years, respectively, Sterling Real Estate reopened under new management. Principles that would have been unimaginable during the empire building. Years that had defined my career, Denny. Had returned as Executive Vice President of Community Relations, a position we'd created to institutionalize the values he'd always advocated but I'd consistently dismissed as commercially naive. His first initiative was establishing the Sterling Family Recovery Fund, which provided health care coverage and financial assistance to every family affected by our previous policies. The Rodriguez family received full coverage for Tommy's cardiac care, plus educational support that would help the 8-year-old pursue his dream of becoming a doctor. Elena Martinez got diabetes management resources and job training that led to a position with better insurance coverage. The Johnson family received both medical support for Mrs. Johnson's cancer treatment and housing assistance that prevented foreclosure during her recovery. Period. These weren't charity gestures or public relations maneuvers. They were acknowledgments that Sterling Real Estate had profited from policies that systematically exploited vulnerable families, and we had moral obligations that transcended legal requirements or shareholder expectations. Danny insisted that every recipient understand exactly why they were receiving support, because previous Sterling Real Estate policies had prioritized profit extraction over human welfare, and we were committed to transforming our business model to prioritize community benefit alongside financial sustainability. The transformation wasn't without costs. Sterling Real Estate's profit margins decreased significantly as we eliminated artificial pricing structures, provided comprehensive employee benefits, and invested in community development projects that strengthened neighborhoods rather than gentrifying them for maximum property value extraction. But our reputation began recovering in ways that surprised industry analysts. Families trusted Sterling Real Estate because they knew we'd acknowledge mistakes and make things right. Employees worked harder because they felt valued as human beings rather than disposable resources. Clients chose our services because they wanted to support businesses that prioritized ethical practices over maximum profit, extraction. Danny's approach to business development focused on projects that created genuine community value, affordable housing developments that included healthcare facilities, commercial spaces designed to support local entrepreneurs, and mixed-income neighborhoods that fostered economic diversity rather than displacement. We can be profitable while being ethical, Danny explained during a board meeting where we reviewed first-year results. But profitability has to serve community welfare rather than replacing it as our primary objective. The numbers supported his philosophy. Sterling Real Estate's revenue had stabilized at about 60% of previous levels, but our costs had decreased proportionally due to reduced legal expenses, lower employee turnover, and community partnerships that shared development risks and rewards. More importantly, we were building sustainable business relationships based on trust rather than aggressive extraction. Property owners knew we'd treat them fairly during acquisition negotiations. Tenants trusted us to maintain properties and address concerns promptly. Local government agencies viewed Sterling Real Estate as a community partner rather than a potential regulatory problem. Danny had also insisted on complete financial transparency. Every transaction was documented in publicly accessible databases that allowed employees, clients, and community members to verify that Sterling Real Estate was operating according to the ethical standards we claimed to embrace. Transparency prevents temptation, he'd explained. When every financial decision is subject to public scrutiny, there's no opportunity for the kind of hidden transactions that enabled Marcus and Stephen's criminal enterprise. The federal investigation had revealed that my older sons had stolen over $45 million through increasingly sophisticated schemes that exploited regulatory gaps and family trust. Their convictions had been featured in business school curricula as examples of corporate fraud and family betrayal, but their sentences had also created opportunities for redemption. Sterling Real Estate became a case study in ethical business transformation, demonstrating that companies could recover from criminal scandals by genuinely committing to community-centered practices rather than just improving their public relations strategies. Danny had been interviewed by business publications, invited to speak at conferences about corporate ethics, and recognized by community organizations for his leadership in transforming predatory business practices into models for responsible development. The real measure of our success, he said during one interview, isn't how much profit we generate, but whether the communities we work in are stronger because of our presence. On the second anniversary of Marcus and Stephen's sentencing, Danny and I visited the Rodriguez family. Tommy, now 10 years old, was thriving academically and had no lingering effects from his cardiac surgery. His parents had both found stable employment with healthcare benefits, and they were saving money for Tommy's college education. Mr. Sterling helped us when nobody else would. Tommy's father told the local newspaper reporter who was documenting Sterling Real Estate's community impact. Not because he had to, but because it was the right thing to do. That's the kind of businessman we need more of in Phoenix. Driving home from that interview, I reflected on the legacy I was leaving compared to the empire I'd once thought defined success. Sterling Real Estate was smaller now, but stronger. We were less wealthy individually, but more valuable to our community. We were building something sustainable rather than extractive. Danny had inherited more than a business. He'd inherited the opportunity to demonstrate that success could be measured by community welfare rather than just profit accumulation. The Sterling name would be associated with ethical practices and social responsibility rather than federal crimes and exploitation. That evening, I updated my will to reflect realities that had been true for years, but which I'd been too proud to acknowledge. Danny wasn't just my heir, he was the son who'd always understood what Sterling Real Estate could become if we had the courage to prioritize integrity over empire building. True inheritance wasn't money or property. It was the knowledge that business could serve community welfare, that success could be measured by human flourishing, and that family legacy was defined by character rather than accumulated wealth. Danny had been teaching me these lessons for years. Finally, I was wise enough to listen. If Robert Sterling's journey from blind pride to redemptive wisdom touched your heart, and if Danny's quiet heroism in the face of injustice inspired you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel for more stories about family courage, second chances, and the power of doing what's right even when it costs everything. Please hit that like button if this story reminded you that true character often hides behind humble circumstances. And drop a comment below telling us about a time when someone's true nature surprised you, whether it was discovering hidden nobility in someone overlooked, or learning that success and integrity can coexist when we have the courage to choose people over profits. Your engagement helps us share more stories about real human triumph, and your insights always enrich our community of people who believe that redemption is possible for anyone willing to choose love over pride.